In the interim today, we're going to be talking about the Antichrist. This grew out of a discussion I had when I was doing a radio talk show. And I was talking about Easter, and a woman called up and accused me of being the Antichrist. And I told her that I thought the Antichrist would be bigger. He has to wrestle Jesus, who I assume is a heavyweight. I'm not even a middleweight. So I didn't think that was going to work. The other thing was that I thought that I should have some special power. I really only have one special power that's come from golf. On the fairway, on the tee, on the green, in a sand trap, doesn't matter. I can shank a golf ball. It's not much of a distinction, but it's all I have. Well, she was not impressed. But it occurred to me that she did not even understand the term Antichrist or where it came from. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. The term anti, you guys got. I'm sure you know that means it's Latin for against. It's the Christ part that throws people. It's not Jesus's last name. It means anointed king. It's a nice Greek word. Anointed king means that somebody was chosen by a priest. The priest said a prayer over olive oil. The olive oil is then dripped onto the person to anoint him so that the prayer goes from the olive oil onto the person. It used to be a very common thing. It was invented by the Egyptians, and it was used all over the world. Today, in the Western world, we don't have many monarchs, but I believe the only one still done is the English monarch is still anointed. Nevertheless, the anointing was accepted throughout the Middle East because Egypt was the largest culture. And so it was picked up by the Judeans. And their first king, Saul, was anointed. The second king decided that it was more valuable than just simply putting anointing on, because other kings who were anointed were assassinated. So he said he could have killed Saul. He's not going to kill Saul because he's anointed. This, of course, had some self-preservation because he hoped nobody would kill him being anointed. It worked. His son followed him, that was David, followed by Solomon, and then his grandson Rehoboam. But Rehoboam didn't do a good job of keeping the country together. David had put together two countries, Israel and Judea. They separated under Rehoboam to two parts. The northern part had their own anointed kings. The southern part, however, continued with the Davidic line. It's one of the longest dynasties in history, well over 400 years of people from the line of David. The Jews also separated kings into two parts. One was a melech. Melech means anointed. It means any king, period, is a melech. But an anointed king is a Mashiach. And a Mashiach has come through the Greek to Messiah. So we have Christ and Messiah mean exactly the same thing. They mean an anointed king. In the north, they had no trouble assassinating these Israeli kings. But in the south, the Davidic line continued all the way down to the time of the Babylonians in the 6th century when Judea was conquered. Israel had already been conquered 200 years earlier by the Assyrians. Well, these folks rebelled eventually and were carried off into captivity in 586. They probably would have disappeared. We've never heard of Judaism, Bible, or anything else. However, the Babylonians were soon conquered by Cyrus the Great, who, by the way, the Jews called a Messiah, an anointed king. And that's because he believed in free will. He was a Zoroastrian. And the Zoroastrian free will concept went into Christianity eventually. And it's this: you have a choice. You can join us, the truth, or you can join anything else, which they called the lie. If you joined the truth, when you died, you went to heaven, another idea the Christians picked up. Or when you die, you go to hell, which is another idea the Christians picked up. So your choice is between heaven and hell. Their theory is, of course, that you would join them rather than risk going to hell. It didn't work with the Jews. They went back, and they went back under the last known Davidic leader. His name was Zerubbabel. We don't know much about him. He was a prince, and he ended up being killed, we think, by the Persians because he decided to revolt against them. So what we do have, however, is the Jews back there. And they are now waiting for their Davidic line anointed king to come and create a Jewish theocracy. Nothing happens because after the Persians, we get the Greeks under Cyrus the Great. Well, they get the idea of the Messiah dies out. We don't hear about it much anymore. Nobody writes about it. We don't have any of the records that say anything about Messiah. When Alexander dies, his empire is divided into three parts, a Greek, an Egyptian one under Ptolemy. Most of you probably know Cleopatra is the last of that group, Cleopatra VI. And there's a Syrian group under the Seleucids. And the Jews are now under the Seleucids. And they revolt in 167 BC. And they fight for 2 years to get the temple free. And that's where we get Hanukkah from. It's a celebration of when they captured the temple. There's no Messiah at all. No mention in the books of Maccabees, which are the two books, the histories of these wars. They don't even thank God, which is why the books are not in the Bible. They're in the Apocrypha, in the extra books. However, there is one book written that does mention an anointed king, and that's the book of Daniel, written around this time with the purpose of trying to encourage the Jews to fight against the Syrians. And it promises that an anointed Davidic king will appear to help them do that. It doesn't happen. There is no such thing. Nevertheless, the concept of Messiah now becomes a little more prominent, and it particularly takes off after the Romans show up in 63 BCE. The Jews realize they have a problem. There is no possible way that a military leader is going to throw out the Romans, because they were obviously stronger than the Greeks, who were obviously stronger than the Persians, and so on. It's mathematically getting really awful. So they come up with another idea. There is going to be either this military Davidic king from the line of David, or there's going to be a pious king. And they say his father will be Joseph from the Bible, who prayed and was saved from an Egyptian prison. By the way, Egypt had no prisons, but that's all right. He is saved from the Egyptian prison and becomes Grand Vizier of the country. They look at that, and his mother will be Miriam, who is Moses' sister. Well, when they finally revolt against the Romans in 66, you have lots of messiahs running around, people claiming to be Messiah. One of the more prominent ones is a guy named John, who after the temple destroyed in 70 gets on a hidden platform and rises up among very startled Roman soldiers wearing a purple robe and insisting he is the anointed king. They treat him with great deference. They do what they do with all captured king. They put him in the head of a victory parade in Rome, and then they strangle him. I hope he enjoyed his moment of glory there. Nevertheless, finally, we notice there's no Antichrist. We've never heard the word Antichrist, hasn't existed. Finally, in around 95 or so, a very, very strange individual who criminally insane, probably, whose also name is John. And by the way, we're going to run into lots of Johns. It's one of those things that you think about toilet humor, but I will not go there. Nevertheless, this John wrote a book we call Revelation. And in it, he tells us the following. One of two beasts are going to show up. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God, to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. All whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. This is a description of an obviously terrible beast that's going to come. No Antichrist. That takes another 10 years. Then we have 3 letters from a man also named John. Again, all these Johns, the Christians like to think are the same people. They're not. And here is the only mention in the gospel in different letters, letter John 1 and John 2, which mention an Antichrist. For many deceivers are entered into the world who confess not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh. This is a deceiver and an Antichrist. What is an Antichrist then? Anybody who doesn't think that Jesus is the anointed Redeemer, okay, the anointed Messiah. Well, this is not the beast. However, Christians put the two together and concluded that the beast was also the Antichrist. And so from that point on, you have a cottage industry of people wondering when the Antichrist is coming. And if he's coming, that would mean that Jesus is coming and the world is going to end. You have this side by side going on here. And so you have different times when people claim it. In the 1100s, Richard the Lionheart was told the Antichrist had been born. And Richard said, I know that. And his courtier says, who is it? Who is it? He said, the Pope. They didn't get along real well. In the next century, a fellow named Joachim de Fiore was authorized by the Pope. He was a very pious man. And he was authorized to determine when the world would end and when the Antichrist would arrive. He had to identify the Antichrist. Now, you have to understand, in John's day, 99.9% of the population would qualify as Antichrist. The numbers really haven't improved much over the generations because even Catholic priests in surveys today do not believe Jesus is an anointed king coming back. So there's all of us, lots of Antichrist running around. Well, Joachim de Fiore looked around and he came up with a fellow named Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great was one of the great monarchs of history. He was a humanitarian. He would have been a Unitarian in his day. He had no interest in religion per se. He was concerned about the people that he ruled over. He did a lot of charity work and efforts to try and help people. He was just, the type person you'd like to have as a ruler if you have to have one. Naturally, he was excommunicated 3 times. Joachim de Fiore picked 1263 as the grand year and the world would end. You'll notice it hasn't happened. Nevertheless, both Frederick and the Pope, and by the way, Joachim de Fiore, all died before 1263. So it didn't work. And it's continued on. And again, just like the Messiah concept, the Antichrist concept began to die out. There just was nothing happening. Even in 1666, which is the 666, supposedly Revelation, when the world ends, there was no claim of an Antichrist, and so on. And we wouldn't run into Antichrist again until the 1800s. In the 1800s, we have the first in-depth investigations into the New Testament as an historical document and the accounts. The German school in the middle of the 1860s, led by Julius Wellhausen, began to discover that the history and the New Testament have nothing in common. There's no correlation. Their factual information is completely wrong, and so on. This got people upset. It actually initiated a field called biblical archaeology, where people went to the Holy Land and dug it up looking for things that support the biblical stories. By the way, that particular field does not exist anymore because everything they found contradicted the biblical stories. It died out in the 1970s. But nevertheless, there were a whole bunch of very religious people. They invented Christmas carols and a variety of other things. That is the ones you're familiar with. They had existed before, but the ones you're familiar with, in order to emphasize the Christian story and to get away from the kind of scholarship that was going on with that. Well, a whole bunch got really religious and said that the Bible is word from word for God. And since it's word from word for God, everything in it is accurate, including the mention of the Antichrist. Now, to do this, of course, they had to drop a few ologies, such as biology, astronomy, sociology, archaeology. Any science that contradicted what they believed had to get rid of. We have those folks still with us today, the evangelical groups and so on. They're still here. And they're still waiting for the Antichrist. As a result, from the late 1800s on, virtually everybody who is in a prominent position, all the popes, monarchs, etc., have been called an Antichrist by somebody. Every president has been called an Antichrist. Winston Churchill during World War II was called the Antichrist. The concept just, attached itself to people that are more deserving, like Mao Zedong and Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, who were responsible for the deaths of millions of people. But nevertheless, this concept has become far more prominent, hence you heard on the radio show. There are reasons why it has survived, even though obviously there's no evidence of that or a Messiah, for that matter, even the Christian version of a Messiah coming down from heaven or the Jewish version of a Messiah that is leading a Jewish theocracy called Israel. The first reason you're going to have that is that Christianity had a problem. It had a dead Messiah. It had somebody of such prominence dead, and supposedly God, there had to be a rival to that. Judaism and Islam, the other prominent monotheistic religions, did not have that problem. So they elevated Satan, a word that means adversary, and turned that into this deep devil thing. And the Antichrist has been associated with that. The second thing is when you're dealing with a hero, heroes need villains to oppose. I mean, where would Spider-Man be without the Green Goblin, or Superman without Lex Luthor, and so on? So they needed somebody of that elevation, and they did that too. For a third reason, you're confronted with this type of situation, and you have to kind of explain it. Evil happens. How do you explain it? Well, you blame it on something. The devil made me do it, as comedian Flip Wilson pointed out. This has become the common thing. It's the devil causing it, because you have to find an answer. And again, Islam and Judaism haven't had that problem. Judaism, the Jews blame themselves. Islam has an imp who tries to lead people astray, not on par with Allah, of course. But Christianity had to blow it up, and they did. And so you have this enormous Antichrist concept that's not going to go anywhere. We're not going to have a Messiah. We're not going to have an Antichrist. The world is going to end on its own. We're hurtling towards it right now when you include COVID and climate change and everything else. So the world's going to end, not with trumpet calls or anything of that nature. On the other hand, then you have people like me getting called the Antichrist. And I'm trying to be positive about it. I'm trying to look at it and say, all right, what can we do out of this to be positive if I'm the Antichrist? And to me, the easiest things to think about is just maybe there's this chance it will help improve my golf game.